the best climber in the history of the Tour de France. Federico Martin Bahamontes was able, at a time when the Spaniards had no prominence in France, to practically alone defeat the powerful Belgian and French teams to raise his arms as winner in Paris. Do you want to know what happened during the 1959 Tour de France? Follow my wheel and I'll tell you. Our story begins in October 1958, when what would be the great triumph of Bahamontes in the Tour de France began. It was an autumn morning in Talavera de la Reina, Spain, when Fausto Coppi, cycling legend at the time and responsible for the Spaniards team, encouraged the Toledan cyclists to try the assault on the final victory of the Tour de France. "If you forget the mountain and do the general, you will win the Tour," were the words of the Italian. Bahamontes' disbelief was at a max. Cycling at that time was a very different sport from today, and Bahamontes was a very different cyclist from the others. Those were hard times in post-war Spain. There was hunger in a good part of the population, among which was our protagonist. Times in which the Spaniard, with his bicycle, climbed tirelessly the slopes of Toledo, carrying fruit, vegetables, and even dedicating himself to the black market. It was during this time that he forged his character as a tireless climber. Federico Martin Bahamontes became a cyclist by chance. It was with 19 years when he began his adventure in this sport, and in 1953, at 25 years old, when he made the leap to professionalism. From that moment, the Eagle of Toledo began to make a name for itself within the peloton. It was in 1954 when his relationship with the Tour de France began. In his first participation, Bahamontes already made clear his love affair with the French race, winning the first of his 6 mountain leader jerseys. That edition would give us one of the greatest legends of the Spaniard. During the ascent to the Col de Romaire, Bahamontes, who during the ascent overtook his rivals in several minutes, had broken one of the spokes of his rear wheel, stopped when he reached the top, ordered an ice cream, and tasted it quietly while waiting for the assistance car to repair the wheel. Legend has it that it was a provocation to his rivals, and he let the story circulate, but actually feared a fall on the descent with that broken tire. This was Federico Martin Bahamontes, a genius. Even many years later, we learned that his name was Alejandro and not Federico. An impressive climber, but very irregular. All the advantage he acquired in the ascents, he could lose it in any descent, even in the plain, and he used to lose a lot of time in flat stages to save strength for the mountain. He had a reputation as a wayward and irregular rider, but on the mountain, he was clearly the best. The Tour de France itself considers him the greatest climber of all time. However, at that time, the Eagle of Toledo was not considered as a rider capable of winning the Tour. The French chronicles of the time presented Bahamontes as if out of a painting by El Greco, and with his stunted body, his gnarled legs, his gaze lost in suffering, and explained that he was too crazy, bohemian, and capricious to think of winning the yellow jersey in Paris. During the 1959 Tour, cyclists were grouped together by national teams, not by commercial marques. This forced cyclists from the same country, rivals all year round, to collaborate on a common goal. The French team included Jacques Anquetil, Roger Riviere, Louison Boubet, Raphael Germaniani, René Privat, André Darriguede. They were unbeatable, but only if they worked together. On the contrary, in Spain, they were years of blockade and rationing, also for cycling and for all of Spanish sport. The Spaniards went to the Tour with third-grade material, and it's explained that they were mainly dedicated to getting category spare parts discarded by the rich French and Belgian squads, which they then resold at a good price in Spain. In a Spain in need of joys and heroes, Bahamontes arrived at the perfect time to become a national symbol, at the height of Manolo Santana or Real Madrid. On June 25, 1959, the 46th edition of the Tour de France started in the town of Mulhouse, consisting of 22 stages, to finish in the velodrome of the Parc des Princes in Paris. 4,355 kilometers where cyclists would have to overcome 3 time trials and the passage through the Pyrenees. As I said before, France represented a very powerful selection with riders like Anquetil, Roger Riviere, or Louison Boubet, but with the doubt of whether so many leaders was capable of playing as a team, as you will see later, this wasn't the case. In previous editions, Bahamontes arrived at the mountain stages without options of victory with a lot of lost time. But this time, the words of the myth Fausto Coppi made the Spanish cyclists more attentive during the first days. After a 45-kilometer time trial in Nantes, the Eagle of Toledo arrived at the first great mountain stage with 6 minutes of disadvantage. Not a very big difference for the time, but now came his specialty. 235 kilometers between Bayonne and Bagnères de Bigorre, where they would have to cross several mountainous difficulties, including the terrible Tourmalet. It wasn't the day of the Spaniard, who was off the hook in the Great Colossus, and on the way to Val d'Isère, lost 4 minutes and its chances of victory. But the French team, in an incomprehensible struggle of egos, didn't pull and left the Spaniard alive, something they would pay dearly for. The next stage took the peloton to Saint-Gudé, crossing Aspen and Peyresoux, without too much news. There were a couple of attempts by Bahamontes and Gol, but the group of favorites came together and the stage was won by André Darrigat. Bahamontes was 8th at 13 minutes and 20 seconds from the lead, 4 seconds better than Gol and 1 minute behind Riviere, with all his chances of victory intact. The big stages were still to come and the tension in the French team was about to explode. Such was the arrogance of the French that a semi-professional rider from his country, Henri Anglade, before everyone's surprise, was able to win a stage and place himself in the positions of privilege, something that his compatriots could not tolerate. They went for him, although without much success. We arrived at the big day, the chrono climbing to Pui de Dom, the legendary volcano where part of the most beautiful and legendary stories and battles of the Grand Boucle have been written. And of course, that year, 1959, wasn't going to be any less. But this time, the protagonist was going to be a Spanish rider, that skinny and ungainly rider, that genius who was forged in hunger, and who would never win the Tour because of his wayward character. He was going to write that day the most important story of his long and successful career as a cyclist before the arrogant French riders, the lascivious French press that ignored him, and an entire country, Spain, in need of sporting successes and heroes to admire. They were 12.5 kilometers of authentic exhibition. Bahamontes won the stage, setting the fastest time on that ascent to the top of the French Massif Central, and sent a clear message to all the other contenders for the final triumph in Paris. He beat Gol in 1 minute 26 seconds, in 3 minutes the surprising Henri Anglade, and in more than 3.5 minutes the specialists Anquetil and Riviere, placing second in the general classification 4 seconds behind the leader. And 3 days after the exhibition would come the big explosion. On the way to Grenoble on July 13, 1959, Bahamontes allied himself with another fabled climber, Charles Gaulle, and they got along perfectly while the French team argued about who should sacrifice themselves in that chase. His hand-to-hand display on the ascent of the Col de la Romerie dynamited the Tour, the same alpine pass where in 1954 he ordered an ice cream and tasted it quietly. The stage was for the Luxembourger, while the Spaniard managed, for the first time, to put on the yellow jersey of the Tour de France in an epic feat for him and for all Spanish cycling. The rivals entered more than 3 minutes later, and the classification left their maximum rivals such as Anquetil, Baldini, and Riviere more than 9 minutes behind. Although there were still complicated stages, the Toledan had everything going for him. Bahamontes stood firm in the mountains of the Aosta Valley and defended himself from Henri Anglade and Jacques Anquetil in the 69-kilometer time trial in Dijon, the penultimate stage, arriving as a brand new leader in Paris. Anglade and Anquetil would escort Bahamontes to Parc des Princes. Anquetil declared himself satisfied. He finished the Tour in 3rd position, but ahead of Riviere. Federico Martin Bahamontes was the first Spaniard to win the Tour de France, becoming a legend of Spanish and world cycling. He could never again conquer the French competition, but he was the king of the mountain on 4 more occasions, with multiple triumphs and duels and spectacular battles for the French mountains. From here, from Epic Cyclists, our humble tribute to this great cyclist, but above all, to this great person. Rest in peace, Federico Martin Bahamontes.